Hey everyone, RogueGold here, and today we've got a video diving into an area of the game that I feel needs some work, and that's Specializations. When Specializations were first announced, I was pretty excited about them. The idea of us, the player, getting a power weapon of sorts was a concept we never really been introduced to before in Division's history, and so the idea of that, as well as additional talent trees for the endgame, seemed very promising. That promise, though, ended when we got our first look at them, for me at least. Don't get me wrong, I'm still a fan of having that big power weapon, and I think it's useful and a lot of fun to mow down some NPCs, but I just think overall the concept and system was a letdown. But I also don't think it would be that hard to revise the specialization system and bring it up to a good point. So, in today's video, I'm going to outline how I would go about changing the individual specs as well as the system as a whole to better the experience and elevate the game. So first, I'll touch on how I would change the system overall before diving into each spec itself. The first thing would be the talent trees, or maybe I should just call them talents. The whole idea of a talent tree is that you have to choose between multiple paths or individual sets of talents so that you can benefit from the things you want to, but it means you may have to sacrifice in some areas or just miss out on them. The purpose of that is kind of defeated when we're just able to max out our tree and get every talent available. Now, some people might disagree with me here and say they'd rather have everything over having to choose, but the counter I'd offer is that when you think about the implications of what a real talent tree system would be. As it is now, the devs have to intentionally weaken the bonuses that we do get, because after grinding out all the points, you have all the perks unlocked. If a tree system was introduced, they could make, for example, 3 distinct paths that you have to choose from to upgrade, with each of those 3 focusing on a different aspect of bonuses. And these said bonuses could be made pretty strong, because the devs know that if you have to get good perks for this one aspect, you will get none of the others. Does that make sense? The other thing I'd change, I'd make overall relates to the specs themselves, but I would significantly refine the class identity. I didn't think about this too much before the Technician came out, but when you look at the perks that you get from that spec, they're all pretty strong and viable, and very specifically made out to aid your skills. Then you look at something like the Gunner or the Demolitionist, which are supposed to be more tanky and heavy-duty classes, and I just feel like there's no vision for that being so. Sure, they have some good individual perks in their respective trees, but I just feel that if every spec had the same vision that the Technician did, it would be a whole lot cooler and more fun. Alright, so I'm going to go over each spec and cover 3 categories for each one. First being how I think their identity could be refined, second how I'd change and restructure their talents into a tree system, and third being the balancing of the weapon itself. Sound good? Let's go. First off, we have the OG Survivalist. Now, before this game came out, this was the spec that I was determined to play just because it had a crossbow, and I was desperately hoping that we'd get compound bows as a weapon class, which could happen one day maybe, but yeah, that was my sole reasoning. So to start off, I think the spec needs to be redefined as a more nomadic/support class. The first big change I'd make for the tree is to give the option for the weapon to either have inherent proximity detonators on the arrows, instead of making you run tip of the spear to unlock them, or give the option for placing traps where you shoot the arrow against a surface, and when an enemy walks by, it detonates. I think that would increase the crossbow's uniqueness and viability by a whole lot. Then I think I would have 2 trees, one for damage and one for healing. The damage tree would be the more nomadic one, and I would give the option to choose between explosive arrows for burst damage, or poison/gas arrows, maybe applying the confused status effect and taking some of your health. This, combined with the proximity trap arrow choice, would make for some very cool combinations and playmaking. In general, I'd give the damage tree some more solo-oriented perks, like some armor on kill, damage buffs against status effects, that could pair really well with the crossbow shots. There's a lot you could do there. For the healing tree, the groundwork is already laid out quite well, I think, with the extra outgoing healing perk, and the spec-exclusive Healing Seeker Mine. The other big thing this tree could have is healing arrows, where your crossbow bolt shoots out a large healing cloud whenever it detonates, maybe with double the size of the Chemlauncher heal and double the healing capacity. This could also make for some very cool plays in PvP, like shooting a trap arrow up ahead and your team pushes up and gets a large chunk of healing when you get near the arrow. I think it'd be really cool. Alright, next up, the Demolitionist. I think this already has the groundwork laid out for one talent tree being more oriented on damage, and explosives more specifically, but I also think a second tree could be implemented for more of a support and tank role. For the damage tree, I definitely keep the explosive damage buff, but maybe also add some talents and perks that relate to your grenade. Perhaps even a utility perk that would help refill grenades for your team in longer engagements. Grenades, explosives, and a focus on your grenade launcher dealing more explosive and AoE damage over direct damage would be a great redefinement. For the tank role, given in how my mind the Gunner is already a tank-like spec, I'd make this one more of a support role as well. Bonuses like advancing in cover grants you extra resistances to status effects or damage, and that can be spread to your team as well through various methods. I think the possibilities are pretty broad on this one to offer survivability and utility to your team. As for the grenade launcher itself, I think it needs to be tuned down for PvP. I understand and support things like the TAC-50 one-shotting to the head, because that takes some skill to land, and it being the weapon it is, that skill should be rewarded. For the grenade launcher, I think it's far too easy to hit enemies for it to be a direct one-shot to players. Instead, I think the focus here needs to change to a disruption of combat instead of a mega overpowered weapon. In my mind, I think the grenade launcher should be tuned to deal 50 to 60% of players' armor in PvP, while also applying a nasty bleed to whoever it hits, as well as knocking them out of cover if they may be in it, or staggering them if they're out in the open. This way, there's some chance to survive this thing, but it's also a force to be reckoned with and shouldn't be brushed aside. Okay, now we've got the last of the original three, and that's the Sharpshooter. This spec has the luxury of being pretty well rounded already. Its weapon is balanced in PvP and PvE in my opinion, and its current talents definitely have a clear identity of letting you output more damage by helping you land more shots. I think I would keep this as the damage tree, and then add an additional support tree. For the damage tree, I would definitely keep the stability and headshot bonuses, and maybe just add some sort of system to reward you for landing consecutive shots, maybe with some form of ramping up damage the longer your hit streak goes. For the support tree, I definitely think this spec could play into status effects really well, maybe by utilizing the unique scope mod you get with the spec in the game now. It would be pretty cool if you could mark enemies by scoping in on them with this mod, and then if your allies hit those marked enemies, a random status effect would be applied. If they hit the body, the effect could be lesser, and a headshot could be greater. You also could maybe do something with the TAC-50 dealing less base damage for this tree, but it applies a guaranteed status effect on impact. I don't know, just something in that realm I feel could work very well for a support role with this spec. Next up, the Gunner, which was added in 2U4. This spec was definitely the most meta for PvP in 2U4 and 2U5 simply because of its medkit, but this has now been a lesser problem due to the fact that the other specs got their medkits buffed to 100% armor, along with the fact that full armor builds aren't the 100% clear-cut best choices now. I think the devs wanted this spec to be somewhat of a tank spec, but didn't quite turn out that way in my mind. I would separate this one into a damage and tank tree. For the damage, the groundwork is set by the rate of fire and armor on kill bonuses the spec gives you now, which I think could play very well into the idea of survivability while still being on the offensive. For the tank spec, it's definitely a fine line between balance and meta, given how armor and survivability is so vulnerable to overtuning. One way to rein in the potential overpowered aspects of a tank spec is to revolve many of the bonuses off of the minigun spec weapon itself. I think it would be an interesting idea to allow certain gameplay actions like tanking damage for your team or soaking up status effects to fill your minigun reserves with a special type of ammo, which when drawn and fired out of the minigun have a distinct lifesteal element to them. I know there's a perk allowing bonus armor off of minigun hits now, but I hardly ever notice it because of how weak it is. I think the idea of playing defensively and protecting your team, then allowing you to go out and be a real tank for a short duration, provided you hit your shots, would be a very potent and non-overpowered way to implement a tank spec. One last note for the Gunner is that the weapon itself needs a buff in both PvE and PvP, because its damage right now is just abysmal. It would be a pretty good idea for a sustained single target damage gun, but right now it's better you shoot someone with your pistol than it is the minigun. And then that brings us to the Technician, which sparked the whole idea for this video in the first place. I think this spec does a really good job of giving added benefits to skill builds, but the one thing that I think needs to be changed is how it gives you a flat 50% skill power buff. That's not very fun. And I mean that in the sense that when I'm making a build, I have one spec in mind that I want to use, but then I see that my skill power is lacking a bit, and I know that if I don't choose the Technician, my heal will be categorically weaker. I would propose a damage and healing tree for the spec, doing away with the flat skill power buff and embracing the kinds of perks you get like the invulnerability field around your stationary skills and the bonus armor when deploying them. I would give those talents to the damage side, along with the skill damage buff there is now, and then for the healing side, I think I would like to add stuff like increased duration and lessen cooldowns on healing skills to help with uptime, as well as maybe something along the lines of your heal becoming more powerful for a time when you heal others in your team. Something in that realm. There's a lot you could do there. For the rocket launcher, I think it's in a pretty good place damage-wise. Its tracking could use some tuning, but that's just how the weapon is, I suppose. It takes 2 rockets roughly to put down a player, which I think is fair. In PvE, it could maybe use a bit of a buff, but overall it still puts out some pretty good numbers. Okay everyone, well that's my thoughts on a reformed and refined specialization system. I know that might be a lot to think about, but all the suggestions and ideas that I just put forward aren't super thought out or balanced considered. I just wanted to demonstrate how I feel there's a lot of room for growth and improvement that this system could adopt, and hopefully ideas and discussions like this could get the devs to start thinking about these things. If you stuck around the whole way through, thank you, and if you like this idea of changing the system up, be sure to give the video a like, and make sure to comment down below your own thoughts and ideas for new talents or changes to the spec system, because I would love to hear them. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to subscribe with notifications on. One of my upcoming videos is going to be my idea and wishes for Specialization 6, so be sure to stay on the lookout for that one because it's going to be pretty good. Thanks once again for watching, guys, and until the next one, RogueGold, out.